Harlan, Creek Valley, Montana. Summer and fall, 1931. There is a particular kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not come with wind or storm or the dramatic crack of ice across a frozen river. It comes quietly. It comes through the walls. It rises up through the floorboards the way groundwater rises in a flooded field, slowly, patiently, with absolute certainty. And by the time you feel it in your bones, it has already been inside your home for hours. It has already been winning. Ruth Larson had known this kind of cold her entire life. She had grown up with it in Norway, in a fishing village on the edge of a sea that did not forgive carelessness. Her father had been a shipwright, a builder of vessels meant to survive waters that could freeze a grown man to silence in under an hour. He had taught her the language of wood and cold and the invisible forces that moved between them. She had spent her girlhood in his workshop learning things that most girls in that time and place were never taught. How to read grain, how to feel for weakness in a plank, how to build a thing that the cold could not find a way into. That knowledge had traveled with her across an ocean. It had survived the years and the distance and the grief that comes from living long enough to lose the people you love. It lived in her hands. It lived in the particular way she looked at a wall not as a finished thing, but as a problem that had not yet been fully solved. On the morning of June the 1st, 1931, Ruth Larson was 63 years old. Her left hand trembled slightly from the mild stroke she had suffered 2 years before. Her hair was white. Her face was the face of a woman who had made peace with hard weather a long time ago. She rose before 5 in the morning, went to the woodshed, and split wood until the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Not because the woodpile was low. The woodpile was fine. She split wood because she needed to prove to herself each morning that her hands still worked, that they could still be asked to do something difficult and would answer. The valley was struggling. The depression had come to Harlan Creek the way it came everywhere. Not all at once, but steadily, like a tide that kept rising after you thought it had already reached the high mark. The mines that had given the valley its livelihood were running at a quarter of their former capacity. Men who had built their families around steady work found themselves standing at the edge of their own property at midday with nowhere to be. Families that had been comfortable were burning fence posts for heat. Families that had already been thin were going without. Ruth and Edmund Larson were not wealthy. They had their land, their cabin, a vegetable garden that Ruth worked herself, and a small herd of cattle that Edmund managed with the careful economy of a man who had long since learned the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. They were not comfortable in the way people counted comfort during good years, but they were steady. They had always been steady. Edmund, everyone in the valley called him Ed, was 67 years old. He was a quiet man. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had learned over the course of a long life that most things worth communicating could not be conveyed through speech. He expressed himself in other ways, in the way he left a second cup of coffee on the table before Ruth came in from the woodshed, in the way he checked the axle on the wagon without being asked, in the way he looked at his wife sometimes with an attention so complete and unhurried that it felt like the most honest thing in the room. He was reading in his chair when Ruth came in from the woodshed that morning, as he usually was. He had been a reader all his life, history mostly, engineering texts when he could find them. He set his book down when she came in and looked at her the way he always looked at her, fully, without pretense. And she nodded at him the way you nod at someone whose presence is such a reliable fact of your existence that greeting them with words would feel redundant. From the back of the cabin there was a sound, small, dry, brief. Then another. Ruth set down her splitting maul by the door and stood still. The cough came again from Nora's room. 6 years old, sleeping. Not yet awake enough to know she was coughing, just a small body doing what small bodies do when the night air has found them and made itself at home in their lungs. Ruth did not move for a long moment. She had heard that sound before. She had heard it in a different country, in a different decade, in a different language. But the sound was exactly the same. The particular dry rattle of a child's chest that has been cold too long. The sound that starts small and quiet and seems like nothing until one morning it does not stop. Until one night it sounds different. Until you understand too late that what you had been hearing was not just a cough. It was 1908 the last time she had heard it. In Tromsø, in a cabin with solid walls and a good iron stove, and every measure that a careful person could take against the cold. Owen had been 5 years old. Her grandson. Her first grandchild. He had the yellow hair of his grandfather, and the stubborn, quiet eyes of his grandmother, and a laugh that could make the adults in a room forget whatever serious thing they had been discussing. Owen had coughed for 3 weeks. On the 4th week, he did not wake up. Ruth closed her eyes. She breathed once slowly through her nose. Then she opened her eyes and began making coffee. She did not go to Nora's room. Not yet. The child was sleeping and the sleep was doing its work. And the best thing Ruth could do right now was to be in the kitchen when Nora woke up with warm broth on the stove and a face that did not broadcast the fear that was moving through her chest like groundwater through stone. Ed watched her from his chair. He did not say anything. He had been married to this woman for 41 years, and he knew without being told what had just happened inside her. He set his book down very quietly and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked at the wall across from him, the north wall of the cabin, the one that faced the mountains, the one that was coldest in winter, and he thought something he had been thinking in various forms for most of the past 2 years. He thought we need to do something about that wall. The sketch appeared on the back of a flour sack 2 weeks later. Ruth had been sitting at the kitchen table after supper. The children in bed, the lamp low, and she had been doing what she sometimes did when a problem would not leave her alone. She had been drawing, not artfully, functionally. The way an engineer draws, not to make something beautiful, but to make something legible, to get a thought out of the mind and into a form that can be argued with. 2 rectangles, one inside the other, a gap of roughly 3 feet between them. Ed came to the table and looked at the drawing without sitting down. She did not explain it immediately. She let him look. That was one of the things she valued most about her husband. He could look at something without demanding that it be explained to him before he had finished looking. After a long time, he said, "The space between." "Yes," she said. "Still air." "Yes." He pulled out the chair and sat down. He looked at the drawing a while longer. "The double hull," he said. Ruth looked at him. "Something like it." Ed had grown up near water. Not boats specifically, but he understood the principle she was reaching toward, that 2 walls with a gap of still air between them could hold warmth in a way that single wall, however thick, however solid, could never quite match. The still air acted as a barrier, not against the cold exactly, against the movement of cold, against the wind's ability to pull heat through wood and stone and mortar the way a draft pulls smoke across a room. It was not a complicated idea. That was the strange thing about it. It was not complicated at all. And yet, no one in the valley had built this way. No one in any of the valleys Ruth had ever lived in had built this way. People had built thicker walls. They had stuffed gaps with rags and pine tar and horsehair and anything else they could find. They had banked snow against the north side of their homes and hung heavy curtains across their windows and done 1,000 small, desperate things against the cold. But no one had thought about the air. The air was free. It cost nothing. It was everywhere. Ed looked at her. How much wood? Rough cut. Green is fine. A great deal of it. He nodded. He did not ask how much it would cost. He did not ask where the money would come from. He stood up from the table, went to the woodshed, and came back with a tin box that Ruth had never seen before. He set it on the table. She looked at it. He opened it. Inside was $90 in small bills and coins carefully folded and sorted. Ruth stared at the money. She looked up at him. "When did you start saving this?" she said. He looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention of his. "The night Nora first coughed," he said. Ruth could not speak. She looked back down at the tin box. She looked at the flour sack with its two rectangles, one inside the other. She looked at her own hand resting on the table, the left one, the one that trembled. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. But something moved through her at that moment that was larger than grief and quieter than joy. The particular feeling of understanding that you have been accompanied all along by someone who saw the same thing. You saw before you saw it yourself. Ed put the lid back on the tin box and set it beside the flour sack. "Tell me what you need," he said. Construction began on the first day of June. Ruth started with the trench. She dug it herself along the north and west sides of the cabin. First 3 feet out from the original foundation, 18 inches deep, filled with coarse creek gravel for drainage. Her left hand trembled on the shovel handle. She switched to her right when the trembling got bad. She did not stop. Ed worked beside her slower than he once had, but steady. She set posts. She began raising the outer frame, rough-cut lumber green where she could get it. Cheap warped in places, knotted and imperfect and exactly right for a structure whose only job was to break the wind before it reached the real wall. She worked methodically. She worked the way her father had taught her to work on the boats. Not fast, not slow, but with a rhythm that could be sustained across a full day without burning the body out before the task was done. By the end of the 3rd day, neighbors had begun to notice. By the end of the first week, the story had a name. Carlton Whitmore coined it at the general store on a Saturday morning. Carlton was 48 years old, the foreman at the Harlan Creek mine, a big-shouldered man with a loud voice and the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in front of people he wanted to impress. He had a woodpile that was the largest in the valley, and he reminded people of this fact with the same regularity that other men mentioned the weather. He was standing at the counter when Ruth came in for nails and a coil of wire. He watched her make her purchase. He watched her turn to leave. And then, in the voice of a man who has already decided what the laugh will sound like, he said it, "There she goes, building herself the old woman's folly." The store went quiet. Ruth did not turn around. She finished tucking the nails into her coat pocket. She pushed the door open and walked out into the June morning. But the name stuck. By Sunday, it was at the church. By Monday, it was at the feed store. By Wednesday, women in Catherine Callahan's quilting circle were shaking their heads with that particular gentle sympathy that is indistinguishable from condescension. Poor Edmund. Poor, sensible Edmund, married to that woman with her strange ideas and her trembling hand and her cabin inside a cabin in the middle of the worst economic depression anyone in the valley could remember. Carlton Whitmore's reasons for mockery were not simple. This is important to understand. He was not a cruel man. He was not stupid. He was a man who had made a significant financial decision. 3 months earlier, he had purchased a cast-iron heating system from Cascade Mining's supply catalog, a modern thermal Supreme stove on an installment plan that stretched his Depression-era budget to its absolute limit. The company had sent a salesman through the valley in February with brochures and testimonials, and the very convincing argument that modern technology had made the old debates about walls and insulation and trapped air entirely beside the point. The right stove, properly fueled, could heat any cabin. Science had solved the problem. Carlton had believed it. He had signed the papers. Now a 63-year-old woman with a trembling hand was building a second wall around her house, and people were watching, and if she turned out to be right, then Carlton Whitmore had spent money he could not afford on a solution to a problem that had already been solved 50 years ago by anyone with enough patience to think clearly about air. His pride and his wallet were aligned against Ruth Larson, and so he laughed. And the valley laughed with him, because in difficult times people follow the loudest voice, and Carlton Whitmore's voice was the loudest in Harlan Creek. June Whitmore sat at the quilting circle and heard the women speak about Ruth Larson and said nothing. She had been married to Carlton for 22 years. She knew the shape of his confidence and the particular blindness that lived inside it. She had watched him be wrong before, not often, but memorably. And she had learned that the moments when his voice was loudest were not always the moments when his judgment was clearest. She stitched her fabric and kept her thoughts inside, and carried a small, quiet shame that she did not name and did not share with anyone. Winifred Holt was 26 years old. She had arrived in Harlan Creek Valley the previous September to teach at the valley's small schoolhouse, 8 grades in one room, 23 students ranging from 6 to 15. The kind of teaching assignment that the Education Board in Billings gave to young teachers they considered promising but unproven. She had grown up in Missoula and had strong opinions about literature and algebra and the proper construction of an argument. And she had very little experience with the particular rhythms of a small valley community where everyone knew everyone, and the social weight of a single comment at the general store could shift the atmosphere of an entire season. She walked past the Larson property one afternoon in early June and stopped at the fence line. The structure Ruth was building was peculiar. There was no other word for it. A frame rising around the existing cabin like a large, ungainly shadow, bigger in every dimension, cruder in its materials, separated from the inner wall by a gap that seemed at first glance like a mistake, like someone had made a measurement error and then kept building anyway. Winifred stood at the fence for a long time. Then she pushed open the gate and walked up to where Ruth was working. Ruth looked up at her, said nothing, kept working. "What is it?" Winifred said. Ruth looked at her steadily. "A coat," she said. "For the house. For the house." Winifred looked at the gap between the inner wall and the rising outer frame. She was a teacher, which meant she had spent enough time in drafty rooms to understand viscerally the difference between a wall that kept the cold out and a wall that merely interrupted it. "How does the air work?" she said. Ruth paused. She looked at this young woman who was asking a real question. Not a polite question, not a mocking question, but an actual question, the kind that expects a real answer. "Still air does not conduct heat," Ruth said. "Moving air carries it away. The outer wall stops the wind. The wind is the thief, not the cold. The wind." Winifred looked at the gap. She thought about this. "And the space traps the air. The space keeps the air still." Winifred nodded slowly. She did not say anything else for a moment. "Why hasn't anyone done this before?" Ruth turned back to her work. "People have," she said. "They called it something different. They put it on boats." Winifred asked no more questions that day. She said goodbye and walked back to the road. She did not make notes in the small journal she usually carried. She just walked home and thought about what she had seen. She came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. She never helped with the construction. Ruth did not ask her to, and she did not offer. But she began to appear at the fence line most days in the late afternoon watching. Sometimes Ruth acknowledged her, and sometimes she didn't. After a while, the young schoolteacher's presence became simply a fact of the construction, like the sound of the creek a quarter mile to the east, or the smell of pine coming down off the ridge. Unremarkable, continuous. The town's building assessor arrived on the 17th of June. Harlan Colby was 57 years old, a master builder who had constructed more of the structures in Harlan Creek Valley than any other man living. He was the son of a carpenter trained in that tradition, and he had spent 3 decades learning the practical language of Montana winters through the buildings he had raised against them. He was also, by appointment of the county, the official assessor responsible for reviewing new construction for code compliance. He arrived without drama, without announcement in his gray truck on a Tuesday morning. Ruth saw him coming up the lane and kept working. He walked the perimeter twice. He measured the gap between the inner and outer walls with a steel tape. He noted the angle of the posts, the depth of the foundation trench, the gap beneath the lowest plank, where Ruth had left a deliberate opening for air circulation. He crouched down and looked at this opening for a long time. Then he stood and made notes on his clipboard without looking at Ruth. When he was finished, he came to stand near where she was working. He cleared his throat. He spoke precisely, without embellishment, in the way of a man who has spent his professional life understanding that imprecise language in construction leads to imprecise construction. He had 2 concerns. The fire separation between the inner and outer structure was insufficient by current county code. The additional load on the original cabin's foundation had not been assessed by a licensed engineer. These were legitimate concerns. He was not manufacturing them. He was not acting on behalf of Carlton Whitmore or anyone else who wanted to see this project fail. He posted the yellow notice on the outer frame before he left. The notice said 30 days to achieve compliance or halt construction. He drove back down the lane slowly. At the road, he turned left instead of right away from town, toward the quieter end of the valley. He drove for about 2 miles and then pulled off the road and sat with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine idling and looked at nothing in particular through the windshield. He sat there for a long time. Ruth did not see this. She could not have seen it. She was still at her work site with the yellow notice in her hand, reading it a second time, and then a third. Not because she did not understand its contents, but because she needed a moment to arrange the anger and the fear and the determination inside her before she allowed herself to respond to any one of them. She folded the notice carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. She picked up her hammer. She kept working. That evening, a neighbor named George Finch stopped by the feed store in town and mentioned in the casual way of someone sharing information they assumed was already public, that he had seen Ed Larson coming out of Dr. Harmon's office 3 times in the past 2 months. He said it without malice. It was simply a thing he had observed and found mildly curious. Winifred Holt was at the counter picking up a parcel when he said it. She said nothing. She took her parcel and thanked the storekeeper and walked home in the late afternoon light. She replayed what she had just heard a few times. She thought about Ed, the way he moved these days, slower than she had expected a man his age to move, resting after carrying things that should not have required rest. She thought about the way Ruth sometimes looked at him when she thought no one was watching, not with fear exactly, but with a particular kind of attention. The attention of someone who is cataloging something. Winifred did not say anything to anyone. She made no notes. But she began to look at the Larson household differently after that, with the careful, quiet observation of a woman who understood that the story she was watching was larger than the wall being built in the front yard. Vera Drummond arrived on a Thursday evening in the third week of June. She was 72 years old. She walked with a cane made from a piece of turned oak, and she moved with the particular economy of someone who has learned that energy spent on unnecessary motion is energy that will not be available later. She had lived in Harlan Creek Valley for more than 40 years, had buried 2 children and a husband, and had planted a garden every spring without exception. She was not close to Ruth. They spoke at church and at the general store, and occasionally at community events, but they had never sat in each other's homes for any length of time. She knocked on the door at 7:30, when Ed had already gone to sit on the porch with his book, and the children were in bed. Ruth opened the door. Vera held a worn leather satchel against her side, with the arm that was not occupied by the cane. She was wearing her Sunday coat, even though it was Thursday, which Ruth noticed and understood to mean that this visit had been deliberated over. "May I come in?" Vera said. Ruth stepped back. Vera came in and sat at the kitchen table. She set the leather satchel on the table in front of her and looked at it for a moment without opening it. Ruth put the kettle on and sat across from her and waited. "I want to tell you something," Vera said, "before I show you what I've brought. Because the showing of it will mean more if you understand the telling of it first." Ruth said nothing. She was good at waiting. "My first husband was a man named Niels Drummond," Vera said. "He was Danish by birth and by temperament, which is to say, he was quiet and thorough, and entirely incapable of letting an idea go once it had taken hold of him. He was a shipwright. He learned his trade in Copenhagen and worked boats in Greenland before he came to this country." She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. "He used to talk in the evenings about the construction of trawlers designed for Greenland waters, the ones that could work in conditions where the cold should have made them impossible to work in. He was very specific about one aspect of those boats: the way the hull was built. Not just thick, there were 2 layers of hull with a gap between them, filled with nothing. Air. Just air." Ruth had gone very still. "He used to say that the still air between those hulls kept men alive in water that should have killed them in 20 minutes. He said it was the most important thing he knew. He spent years trying to calculate what it would mean for a building, for a house. He filled journals with it." She unlatched the satchel. She reached inside and brought out a book. Not a commercial volume, a handmade journal, the cover worn flat and soft with 40 years of handling the spine, repaired twice with leather cord. She set it on the table between them. Ruth looked at it. "He died in 1891, Vera said. "He was 43 years old. He died with the idea still in his head, and the calculations still unfinished." She pushed the journal gently across the table. "I've carried that for 40 years, she said. "I read the parts I could read. I found someone to translate the Danish sections. I understood enough of it to know that he had found something true, but I did not know what to do with it. I did not know who to give it to." Ruth placed her hand on the journal cover without opening it. "When I heard what you were building," Vera said, "I walked to my window and I stood there for a long time. And then I sat down in my chair and I wept. I wept the way I had not wept since the day he died." The kettle was beginning to murmur. Ruth did not get up to tend to it. "Mrs. Drummond," she said. "Yes. I lost a grandson in 1908. His name was Owen. He was 5 years old. He died of cold in a cabin I thought was sound." Vera nodded. She had known this, the valley had known this in the way that valleys know everything eventually. But she had not heard Ruth say it plainly before. "That is what I am building," Ruth said. "Not a second wall, not a coat. I am building what your husband knew." Vera looked at her steadily. "I know," she said. "That is why I am here." Ruth opened the journal. The first pages were in Danish, careful, cramped handwriting in dark ink. The letters tall and regular, in the way of someone who had been taught penmanship with some formality. But beneath the text and between the paragraphs, and filling the margins and the backs of pages and every available surface, were drawings, measurements, calculations, cross-sections of hull construction. Plans for a double-walled structure. Not a boat, but a room, a building. A dwelling with specific notations about the depth of the air. Gap, the positioning of ventilation, openings, the relationship between the outer structure's exposure and the thermal stability of the inner one. Ruth could not read the Danish. She did not need to. She could read the drawings the way her father had taught her to read drawings, as a language prior to words, as the most honest form of communication available to a person who is trying to solve a real problem. She turned pages for a long time without speaking. The kettle began to whistle and she did not hear it, and Vera rose quietly and took it off the heat herself. When Ruth finally looked up, her eyes were clear and direct, and there was something in her face that had not been there when she opened the door. A quality of confirmation, of being seen across a distance of 40 years by a man she had never met. A Danish shipwright who had sat at a different table in a different country and drawn the same 2 rectangles she had drawn on the back of a flour sack in her own kitchen. "May I keep this?" she said. "It is why I brought it," Vera said. They drank their tea. They did not speak very much. There was not a great deal that needed to be said. When Vera left, she walked down the lane slowly with her oak cane and the empty leather satchel, and she did not look back at the house. She went straight home. She sat in her chair by the window. She looked out at the dark valley and she felt something loosen inside her chest, something that had been held for 4 decades, some knot of unfinished purpose, and she breathed in slowly and did not cry. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her for another 2 hours after Vera left. Ed came in from the porch and stood in the doorway and looked at his wife reading the old journal with that absolute concentration of hers, and he could tell from the quality of her stillness that something significant had just happened. He did not ask. He got a glass of water. He went to bed. The yellow notice from Harlan Kobe was the legal problem. Ruth spent 3 days thinking about it. The fire separation issue was addressable. She could install a simple baffle system between the outer and inner structures that would interrupt any fire path between them. The foundation load concern was more complicated. She needed an engineering opinion, and engineering opinions cost money that the tin box could not spare if they were going to have enough left for materials. She went to George Finch and explained the situation. Finch was a practical man, not given to sentiment or charity, but he had been watching the construction with the quiet attention of someone who finds himself unable to look away. His wife had been sick 2 winters running, and he had spent both winters burning through twice the wood he'd expected, and still watching her shiver. He agreed to let Ruth survey the foundation of his own barn built 4 years earlier by Harlan Kobe on a similar foundation type, and use that survey data as a comparison. It took her 4 more days. The comparison was sufficient. She brought it to Kobe's office in town without an appointment and set it on his desk without preamble. Kobe looked at the documentation for a long time. He was a thorough man. He read everything twice. He did not speak while he was reading. When he was done, he set it on the desk and folded his hands over it and looked at her. "The baffle system," he said. "Already planned," she said. He was quiet for another moment. "The fire rating on the outer planking. I'll replace the south face with cured pine. I have enough." He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall behind her head. He seemed to be solving a different problem than the one in front of him, some interior calculation that had nothing to do with baffles or fire ratings. "The notice is withdrawn," he said. Ruth stood up. "Thank you," she said. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Mrs. Larson." She turned. Kobe was still looking at his folded hands. "My daughter's name was Rosalind," he said. "She was 4 years old." Ruth did not move. "January of 1908, he said. "The cabin I built for my family. I built the finest cabin in this valley. I was proud of it." He stopped. "She was 44 degrees when she died. I was burning a cord of oak every 6 days." The silence in the room was the kind that asks not to be broken. "I told myself it was the cough," he said. "I told myself it was God's will. I told myself everything." His voice had gone very quiet. "You should finish your wool, Mrs. Larson." Ruth walked back to her truck. She sat in the cab for a moment with her hands in her lap. She thought about Owen. She thought about Rosalind. She thought about a Danish shipwright who had died in 1891, with calculations in a journal that nobody could read. She thought about all the fathers and grandfathers and mothers who had sat in rooms they had built with their own hands and watched the cold win. She started the engine. She drove home. She went back to work. The outer wall was completed on the 28th of September. It wasn't beautiful. It was not even what most people would call presentable. The green lumber had warped in places, pulling the outer frame into slight irregularities that gave the structure a lopsided improvised quality, like something that had been started by one person and finished by another. The south face was cured pine cleaner than the rest, where Ruth had replaced the original planking to satisfy Kobe's fire rating requirement. The north and west faces were the original rough-cut boards, some of them twisted along their length, all of them functional. Ruth stood beside Ed in the September evening light and looked at it. She did not speak for a long time. Ed put his arm around her shoulders. He was wearing his heavier coat, the wool one. He had started wearing it earlier in the season than usual. She noticed this and said nothing. "It looks like something that works," Ed said. Ruth looked at the gap between the outer wall and the original cabin, that 3-foot corridor of still air open at the bottom through the gravel bed, open at the top, through the baffle vents she had cut beneath the eaves. Invisible from the outside, doing nothing, doing everything. She thought of Niels Drummond's journal, of the cross-sections of Greenland trawlers, hull within hull, the nothing between them, that was not nothing at all. She thought of Owen. She leaned her head against Ed's shoulder and said nothing back. The first frost came on the 5th of October, 3 weeks ahead of the usual date. Ruth woke before dawn and stepped outside and heard the grass crack under her boots, and she stood in the cold morning for a moment with her breath showing white against the dark. She went inside. She stoked the iron stove. She started the coffee. From the back of the cabin, she heard nothing. She stood at the kitchen counter and listened. Silence. She walked down the short hallway to Nora's door. She opened it an inch and looked in. Nora was sleeping, small, curled around herself under the quilt. Her breath was soft and regular and entirely unremarkable. Ruth stood in the doorway for a long time. She pressed her left hand, the trembling one, flat against the doorframe. She was 63 years old. She had crossed an ocean and buried people she loved and watched a valley laugh at her through one of the worst summers of her life. She had spent 4 months of her body's diminished energy on a structure that most of her neighbors considered a monument to poor judgment. She had read by lamplight the journals of a dead man who had seen what she saw and never had the chance to build it, and her granddaughter, who had coughed every night since September of the year before, had slept through her first cold night of a Montana autumn without making a sound. Ruth closed the door. She went back to the kitchen. She turned to the stove. She stood there, with her back straight, and her trembling hand pressed flat against the stovetop edge, and she breathed slowly until she could be certain of the calibration of her own face. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee. She put Ed's on the table beside his chair. She took her own to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the strange, ugly, ungainly structure that surrounded her home like an oversized coat. The valley was quiet. The cold was out there. It had always been out there, patient and absolute, moving across the ridgeline and down through the pines. The way it had always moved, looking for cracks, looking for gaps, looking for a way in. This year it would have to look harder. Harlan Creek Valley, Montana. December 1931 and January 1932. The cold came on the 4th of December and did not leave. It arrived without ceremony. No great storm, no dramatic announcement from the sky. The temperature simply dropped on the morning of the 4th, fell to 22 below zero by mid-afternoon and stopped there, as if it had found the number it was looking for and decided to stay. The sky was clear and pale and utterly indifferent. Smoke from every chimney in Harlan Creek Valley rose straight up into that pale sky with no wind to push it, which was the only beautiful thing about those first days. That column of smoke, clean and vertical above every house in the valley, every family burning what they had laid in for winter, every stove working against the arithmetic of cold. By the 10th of December, the temperature had fallen another 9 degrees, 31 below. The kind of cold that makes wood brittle, that cracks the water in the ground and heaves fence posts sideways. That kills cattle in barns if the barns are not properly insulated, and sometimes kills them anyway. The kind of cold that the old-timers in the valley spoke of in specific terms, not as weather, but as an opponent. A thing with intention. A thing that was looking for weakness the way a predator looks for weakness, methodically, without hurry, with all the time in the world. Inside the Larson cabin, the thermometer on the kitchen wall read 67 degrees. Nora sat at the kitchen table in her cotton socks, drawing horses on the back of an old seed catalog. She drew them carefully with the serious concentration of a child who has decided that drawing horses is among the most important activities available to her. Silas sat by the window with a geography book open on his lap, following a river across a map with his finger. The stove was burning. Ruth kept it burning around the clock in December, but its damper was nearly closed. The fire inside was small and controlled, and doing a fraction of the work that the stoves in every other house in the valley were doing. Ed sat in his chair. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the children. He looked at the damper on the stove, nearly closed in December, which would have seemed like madness to any other household in Harlan Creek, and which was in fact the most eloquent argument available for what his wife had built. He looked at all of this with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who is memorizing things. He had been memorizing things for weeks. Ruth moved through the kitchen without looking at the thermometer. She had stopped needing to check it. She knew what it said, the way she knew the weight of her splitting maul and the sound of the creek when the water was running high through repetition through the body's own accounting. She knew the cabin was warm because she could feel it in her feet on the wooden floor. She could feel it in the absence of the particular muscular tension that comes from living in a cold house, that constant unconscious bracing against discomfort that the body maintains so automatically that most people don't realize they're doing it until it stops. She refilled Ed's coffee without being asked. He put his hand briefly over hers as she set the cup down. A small gesture, the kind that only means something after 40 years of similar gestures. She moved back to the stove. Outside 31 below, inside 67 degrees. The valley was not managing equally well. Carlton Whitmore had laid in what he considered a more than sufficient wood supply. He had told anyone who would listen that his cord count was the highest in the valley. which was probably true. What he had not accounted for was the rate at which his cast-iron thermal Supreme stove consumed wood in temperatures that had not been seen in Harlan Creek in over 20 years. The stove was efficient. The salesman had been technically accurate about that. It was efficient in the range of temperatures for which it had been designed. But sustained 30 below zero temperatures were not that range, and the gap between the stove's design parameters and the actual demands of this particular winter turned out to be significant. By the 14th of December, Carlton had burned through his seasoned wood. He was not a man who admitted problems early. He spent 2 days convincing himself that the remaining green pine would be adequate, that the reports he had read about greenwood's inferior burning characteristics were exaggerated or applied to other stove designs, or could be overcome with sufficient volume. He began burning it on the evening of the 14th, stacking it heavy in the firebox, running the stove hot to compensate for the wood's moisture content. The flue began collecting creosote on the 15th. He did not know this yet. Creosote builds silently in the dark interior of a chimney, invisible and patient, a slow accumulation of unburned hydrocarbons depositing on the inner walls of the flue, in a substance that looks like black varnish and burns when it finally burns with the intensity of something that has been waiting a long time for the right conditions. By December the 18th, the Whitmore cabin was at 42 degrees and falling despite the stove running at capacity. June had a fever. It had started 2 days earlier as a mild thing, the kind of low-grade temperature that arrives with the deep cold and usually passes in a day or two. By the morning of the 18th, it was not mild. She was in the back bedroom under every quilt the house contained. And when Carlton pressed his palm to her forehead and felt the heat coming off her skin, something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He put more wood on. The stove roared. The cabin temperature did not rise. He stood in his kitchen. The kitchen with the modern cast-iron stove and the installment payment plan and the brochure still folded on the shelf above the door. And he looked at the temperature, and he looked at his children huddled on the far side of the room, and he looked at the doorway to the bedroom where his wife lay. And he understood with the particular clarity that comes to people who have been wrong, in a way that matters exactly what he had done. He had laughed. He had stood at the counter of the general store and provided the name that the Valley had used to dismiss a 63-year-old woman's careful work. And he had done it because his wallet was committed and his pride was engaged, and the alternative acknowledging that she might know something he did not had seemed at the time like a cost he did not need to pay. The cost had arrived. He put on his heaviest coat. He told his oldest boy to keep the stove going and not to open the bedroom door. He stepped outside into 35 below zero and started walking north along the valley road toward the Larson property. It was 2 miles. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts along the fence lines. He kept to the middle of the road where the wind had compressed the surface to something more manageable. The cold was immediate and absolute, the kind that takes the moisture from your eyes in seconds and makes your beard a fixed thing, white and rigid against your face. He fell twice in the first quarter mile where the road dipped toward the creek crossing. He got up both times without pausing. He fell again at the top of the rise a mile in where the wind had scoured the road to bare ice, and this time it took him longer to get his footing. He lay there for a moment on the cold road, with his cheek against the ice, and said June's name quietly once, and then got up and kept walking. He arrived at the Larson gate at 2 o'clock in the morning. He stood there for a moment with the snow piled on his shoulders, and his beard a solid frozen thing against his face, and the cold working through every layer he was wearing. The cabin inside the cabin, the strange, ugly, double-walled thing he had named and mocked and dismissed, sat at the end of the lane with a thin thread of white smoke rising from its chimney. Barely any smoke. The fire inside was small. The fire inside was enough. He pushed open the gate and walked up the lane. He stood at the door. He had not stood at this door before. He had ridden past it many times. He had looked at it from the road and formed opinions about it, and shared those opinions with anyone who would listen. He had never knocked on it. He raised his fist. He knocked. There was a brief pause, long enough for him to understand that the sound of his knocking had reached someone inside. And then the door opened. Ruth Larson stood in the doorway in a wool robe with a lamp in her hand. The warm air from the cabin rolled out into the night around her like something physical. It was not just warm air. It was the difference between the temperature in which Carlton Whitmore had been walking for the past 40 minutes and a temperature in which children could sit barefoot at a kitchen table. It was a wave. It was a wall of summer pushing against the winter, and it hit him in the face and the chest and the lungs all at once, and his knees bent slightly under it. Ruth looked at him. He looked at her. He could not speak. His jaw was rigid with cold, and his throat had closed with something that wasn't cold, and he stood there at her door unable to produce a single word of explanation. Though the explanation was written entirely in his face, and she read it without difficulty. She stepped back. She stepped to the side. She opened the door wider. "Come in, Mr. Whitmore," she said. He came in. The warmth surrounded him so completely that it took several seconds for his body to process it. That involuntary stagger of a person whose nervous system has been running one set of calculations and has suddenly been handed an entirely different set to work with. He caught himself on the doorframe. He straightened. Ed was already out of his chair. He had heard the knock, and he had read the situation in the single second it took to look at Carlton Whitmore's face in the lamplight. "How bad?" Ed said. Carlton found his voice. "Fever. 2 days. The stove." He stopped. "The flu." Ed nodded once. He looked at Ruth. A complete communication in half a second. Ruth was already moving coat from the hook boots from beside the door, the heavy wool blankets from the cedar chest, the 2 fire bricks she kept warming on the edge of the hearth for exactly this kind of emergency, wrapped now in flannel. Carlton started to say something. Ruth talked over him, not unkindly. "Sit," she said, "by the stove. Your boys need a father who didn't die in a snowdrift." She did not pause to watch him comply. She was already pulling on her coat. Ed moved toward his own coat. Ruth looked at him. Just looked at him. One moment, Ed stopped. He understood. His heart. The temperature outside. 2 miles. He stood still, with his hand on his coat, and his face saying something that was not surrender, but was close to it. The expression of a man who has realized that the most useful thing he can do is remain where he is. "Stay with the children," Ruth said. Not as a command, as a fact, as the only possible arrangement. She went out. Carlton Whitmore sat down in Ed Larson's chair beside Ed Larson's stove, in the cabin he had spent 6 months, publicly mocking, and held a cup of coffee in his shaking hands and looked at the floor. Ed stood in the kitchen for a moment after Ruth left. He went to the window and watched the lamp moving down the lane toward the barn. Then he went to the bedroom hallway and looked in on Nora and Silas, both sleeping Nora quiet. And then he came back to the kitchen and put a fresh pot of water on the stove and sat across from Carlton Whitmore and did not say a single word about the old woman's folly, or the cast-iron stove, or the installment payments, or any other thing that might have been said. He just sat there. Carlton looked up eventually. Ed met his eyes without expression, not with warmth and not with judgment, with the basic level regard of one man for another. Carlton looked back down at his coffee. After a long time, he said very quietly, "I'm sorry." Ed looked at the stove. "Drink your coffee," he said. Ruth brought June Whitmore home on the sled at 3:30 in the morning, wrapped in 3 blankets with the hot fire bricks at her feet, barely conscious. Breathing in the shallow way of someone whose body has decided to redirect all available resources to the essential functions and let the rest wait. Ruth got her inside and into the back bedroom. Nora and Silas moved to the kitchen wrapped in quilts, asleep again within minutes. With the uncanny adaptability of children. And she got June's coat off and her boots off, and her temperature taken and a wet cloth on her forehead, all with the efficient, undemonstrative care of someone who has done this before and does not need to perform competence because competence is simply what she has. Carlton came to the doorway of the bedroom and looked at his wife. June did not wake. She breathed. She coughed once, a deep, wet sound, and then settled again. Carlton sat in the corner of the room. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He watched his wife breathe with the fixed concentration of a man whose entire world has contracted to a single point. Winifred Holt had been at the Larson cabin since the storm began. The school had closed on December the 10th, when the temperature made the building unsafe. The schoolhouse had no insulation to speak of, and keeping it at a livable temperature for 23 children across a full school day would have required burning through the entire heating budget before February. Winifred had been boarding in town at the Finch family's spare room. But when the road between town and the Finch property became impassable, she had found herself by a series of practical decisions, rather than any single deliberate choice at the Larson cabin instead, closer accessible and demonstrably warm, in a way that the boarding house was not. Ruth had said without hesitation, "The room at the end of the hall." Winifred had been there for 9 days when Carlton Whitmore arrived in the night. She had come to understand in those 9 days several things she had not understood before. She had understood first what Ruth had meant when she said, "The wall stopped the wind, and the wind was the thief," because she had spent enough time in that 3-foot corridor between the inner and outer walls to feel what Ruth had built in her body, rather than just in her mind. The still air in that corridor was not cold. It was cool, the way a cellar is cool in summer, the ambient temperature of something that is neither heated nor exposed. And on the other side of the inner log wall, which she had pressed her palm against several times privately when she was sure no one was watching, was the retained warmth of a building that had been holding its own temperature for 6 weeks, against conditions that were defeating every other structure in the valley. She had understood second something about Ed Larson. She had watched him with the careful peripheral attention she had developed as a teacher, the ability to monitor a room without appearing to monitor it. She had watched him rest when he did not need to rest. She had watched Ruth's eyes track him from across a room with an attention that was too controlled to be casual. She had watched the way Ed sometimes sat in his chair, with his hand pressed flat against his own sternum briefly, almost unconsciously the way a person checks on something they are worried about. She had said nothing about any of this to anyone, but she had kept watching. She had understood third, and this was the understanding that had been building in her notebook across 9 days of observation. That the story she was watching was not the story she had come to Harlan Creek Valley to write. She had come to teach school. She had come to learn a rural community. She had come in the ambitious private aspirations she did not share with the Billings School Board, to eventually write something worth reading about the people and conditions of the Northern Valley communities during the Depression years. What she was watching was something else. She was watching a woman build a proof, and she was watching a valley decide whether to accept or reject it. And she was watching in the Carlton Whitmores and Harlan Cobys and Vera Drummonds of that valley the full human machinery that determines whether a true thing gets believed, which has very little to do with the truth, and almost everything to do with the cost of being wrong. She sat in the corner of the kitchen through Carlton's arrival, and Ruth's departure, and Ed's silent hospitality, and she held her notebook on her knee and did not write in it. She just watched. June Whitmore's fever broke on the afternoon of the third day. It broke the way fevers break, not dramatically, but as a kind of release, the body's temperature sliding back toward the livable range in the span of a few hours, the color returning to the face, the breathing deepening and slowing into something that sounded less like struggle and more like rest. Ruth was at the bedside when it happened. She felt it in the cloth on June's forehead. Before she saw it in June's face, the change in temperature, the shift from the dry, scorching heat of a dangerous fever to the damp, ordinary warmth of a body that is recovering. She wrung out the cloth. She sat back. June opened her eyes sometime later, late afternoon, the light in the room going gold and flat from the low December sun. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the unfamiliar walls, then at the figure sitting in the corner of the room. Her husband. Carlton had not moved from that chair in 3 days, except to use the outhouse and to eat the food that Ruth or Ed brought to the doorway. He had not slept in any way that could be called sleep. He had simply sat there and watched his wife breathe with the same intensity and the same stillness hour after hour, in the way of someone who has decided that watching is the only thing they have to offer, and they will offer it completely. June lifted her hand. Carlton crossed the room in 4 steps. He took her hand in both of his and pressed it against his face, and the sound that came from him was not a word and not a sob, but something underneath both of those. The sound a large, loud, confident man makes when the architecture of his certainty has been removed, and what remains is just the bare structure of what he loves. Ruth stood up quietly. She left the room. She closed the door behind her. She walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter with her back to the room for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Ed, who was sitting at the table with his book open and unread in front of him. He looked back at her. She nodded once. He let out a breath, a slow, careful breath, the kind that tells you the person has been holding something for a long time. He closed his book. The night of December the 21st was the longest night of the year. The thermometer at the county seat, which a correspondent for the Billings Gazette would record the following morning, read 38 below zero. With wind chill, it was worse. It was the kind of temperature that makes the night itself seem structural, like a weight pressing down from the sky, like something that has decided to test the carrying capacity of everything beneath it. Harlan Colby could not sleep. He had not slept well in many nights. He sat in his chair in front of his own stove, the finest stove in the finest house he had built in 40 years of building, and fed it another log, and watched the fire, and thought about the temperature outside, and the temperature inside, and the gap between the two, which was not as wide as it should have been. His home was at 41 degrees. He was burning through his seasoned oak at a rate that told him with the precision of a builder's arithmetic that he would run short before the winter was over. He was 57 years old. He had built more structures in this valley than any other man. He had built them according to every principle he had learned, according to every code and standard and tradition that had accumulated over his lifetime in this trade. He had built them carefully. He had built them well. And every one of them was cold. He sat with this thought for a long time. He rose from his chair sometime after 8 o'clock in the evening. His wife, Constance, stirred in the bedroom. "Harlan, go back to sleep," he said. "I'm going out." A pause. "It's 40 below." "I know." "Where?" He paused at the door. "Larson's." He did not explain. He went to the barn and hitched his horse to the sled and loaded half a cord of seasoned oak in the back. He told himself as he worked that he was going to check on a neighbor whose heating system had surely failed by now. Because systems failed, and the double-walled structure Ruth had built was an untested design by an amateur builder in conditions that would test any structure. And the responsible thing for a man in his position to do was to check. That was the story he told himself. But there was another story underneath it, one that he had not said aloud, and would not say aloud until he arrived and saw what he saw. He drove the sled down the valley road in the cracking cold. The stars were out brutally bright the way stars get in weather like this, as if the cold has stripped the air of everything that might filter them. The horse moved steadily. The sled runners made a sound on the hard snow that was almost musical, a sustained high note, constant and clean. He pulled into the Larson lane at 9 o'clock. He stopped at the gate. The cabin sat at the end of the lane inside its outer frame, and from the chimney there rose a thread of smoke. Just a thread. Pale white. Thin. Unhurried. The smoke of a small fire in a warm building, not the heavy, desperate column of a stove, working at capacity against a losing battle. Harlan Kobe sat on the sled and looked at that thread of smoke for a long time. He drove up to the front door. He got down from the sled. He knocked. Ruth opened the door. The warm air came out that wave, that rolling displacement of the night's temperature by something entirely different, something that belonged to a different season entirely. Harlan stepped back half a step before he caught himself. "Mr. Kobe," Ruth said. "Mrs. Larson." He held up a hand toward the sled. "I brought wood. I thought—" He stopped. "Come in," Ruth said. He came in. He did not remove his hat immediately. His eyes were adjusting his mind, doing something that was not quite adjustment, more like negotiation. The kitchen was lit by 2 lamps, warm and even. Ed sat at the table. Carlton Whitmore was in the far chair. Harlan registered this and filed it without comment. Nora and Silas were at the kitchen table with drawing things spread between them, and they both looked up at him with the mild curiosity of children for whom the presence of an adult visitor is interesting but not alarming. Nora was wearing cotton socks, a thin cotton shirt. She was drawing her horses. Harlan looked at the thermometer on the wall. The mercury sat at 68 degrees. He looked at it for a long time. He was a man who measured things for a living. He understood what a thermometer said and meant and implied. Outside 38 below, inside 68 degrees. A differential of 106 degrees. He had spent the past 3 weeks burning through his finest seasoned oak to maintain 41 degrees in a house he had built with his own hands, with every skill he possessed. 106 degrees of differential. He walked to the north wall, the wall that faced the mountains, the coldest wall in any Montana cabin, the wall that the wind found first, the wall that lost heat fastest, the wall that a builder worried about above all others. He removed his right glove. He pressed his bare palm flat against the log. The wood was cool, October cool, the temperature of an interior wall in autumn before the deep cold has set in, not the bone cold of a wall that has been fighting the outside all night and losing, not the damp, resigned cold of wood that has absorbed more than it can hold. Cool and still and stable in the way of something that has been protected from the full force of what it faces. He pressed his forehead against it, and the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was the sound of a calculation completing 40 years of building, 40 years of certain knowledge about what walls could and could not do, arriving in this moment at the result that it had been moving toward all along. And the result was not the one he had believed in. He sank to his knees on the wooden floor. Ruth did not move. Ed did not move. Carlton Whitmore looked up from the far chair. Winifred, in her corner with her closed notebook, went absolutely still. Harlan. Kobe knelt on the floor with his bare palm and his forehead pressed against the warm inner log wall of Ruth Larson's cabin, and said the name he had not said aloud in 23 years. Rosalind. The kitchen held the word. His daughter, 4 years old. Yellow hair and a specific way she had of falling asleep with both fists curled under her chin like a small fighter resting between rounds. January 1908. In the cabin he had built for his family, the finest cabin in the valley, the one everyone admired. The stove burning a cord of oak every 5 days, the walls as tight as he knew how to make them. 44 degrees inside on the day she died. He had been burning the stove at its maximum, and the cabin was at 44 degrees, and his daughter lay in the back room with a cough that had gone deep, and her lips the color of winter sky. He had told himself it was the cough. He had told himself it was the weakness in her lungs. He had told himself everything except the one thing. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time, in a space not designed for carrying. "We have been building coffins," he said. "All of us. Every house in this valley. 30 years of building, and we have been building coffins and dressing them up with good timber and telling ourselves the cold was God's decision and the dead were God's will." He stopped. "I built that cabin with my own hands. I was proud of it. I put Rosalind in a room in a house I built, and the cold got in anyway. And she died in my arms at 44 degrees. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking the way a man speaks when he has been silent too long, not performing the confession, but simply needing to discharge it, the way pressure seeks any available opening. "Mrs. Larson," Ruth said. "Yes. I posted that notice on your wall in June because the code required it, and I followed the code because the code was all I had. Every house in this valley was built by the same code. Every house is 41 degrees tonight." His hand pressed flat against the log. "And this wall is 68. Ruth let the silence stand. Harlan lifted his head from the wall. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man at the far end of a long reckoning. "You should have been building these walls 30 years ago. We all should have." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Mr. Kobe," she said. He waited. "The wood," she said. "Give it to the Miller family. Their baby has been sick since November. They are out of anything dry." Harlan blinked. "We do not need it," Ruth said. "As you can see." He looked at the thermometer again. He looked at Nora drawing her horses in the warm lamplight. He closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "All right." He got up from the floor slowly, with the stiffness of a man who has been kneeling on cold boards and is 57 years old. He put his glove back on. He picked up his hat from where he had dropped it. He walked to the door. At the door, he turned. "Mrs. Larson," he said, "in the spring." He stopped, started again. "In the spring, will you—" He looked at his hands. "Will you teach me—" Ruth looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in her face that was triumph, and nothing that was vindication, and nothing that was the particular satisfaction of a person who has been proven right after a long argument. There was something quieter than all of those things, something that recognized the cost of what he had just asked. "Yes," she said. "In the spring." He went out into the dark. The sled moved away down the lane, the runners singing on the hard snow, the half-cord of Miller wood shifting slightly with the movement. Winifred opened her notebook. She did not write for a long time. She looked at the page. She listened to the quiet of the cabin, the tick of the stove, the soft breath of the children, the distant howling of the wind against the outer wall that was barely audible in here, a rumor of violence happening somewhere farther away. She looked at Ruth, who had turned back to the kitchen and was moving with the economy of a woman who has other things to attend to and will not spend any more time on the thing that just happened than that thing requires. Winifred put her pen to the paper. She did not write what she had seen tonight. Not yet. She was not ready to write what she had seen tonight. She wrote instead what she had been thinking for 9 days about a gap of 3 feet between two walls, about the physics of still air, about the things a person can understand in their mind, and the things a person can only understand through their hands on a wall in December. She wrote it slowly and with care, the way a person writes something they want to get right. The children were asleep. Ed was asleep, his book closed on his chest. His breathing the slow, even breathing of a man at rest. Ruth had covered him with the second quilt without waking him with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this particular act of care so many times it has become a reflex. She sat at the kitchen table alone. Outside, the wind was finding the outer wall and working along it, looking for gaps, looking for cracks, looking for the place where the air moved and could be exploited. Ruth listened to it from inside. It was not loud in here. It was the sound of something happening at a distance, something that was not getting closer. She put her hand flat on the kitchen table, the left hand, the one that trembled. She watched it. The trembling was always worse late at night when the body was tired and the resources that kept it managed were running low. The fingers moved slightly against the table surface with a motion she did not choose and could not stop. She had been watching this hand for 2 years. She had been watching it the way you watch something you are afraid of, with that particular stillness that is the opposite of looking away. Because looking away only means it can surprise you. She had built an outer wall around her home with this hand. She had driven a sled through a night at 35 below zero with this hand. She had pressed the palm of this hand against log and plank and gravel and cold air and warm wood and the forehead of a woman with a fever. The hand trembled. It continued to function. These were not contradictions. She thought about Owen. She thought about him the way she had learned to think about him over 23 years. Not with the raw and unmanageable grief of the early years, but with the particular quality of memory that comes after a long time. Clear, specific, unmistakable, and finally bearable. The yellow hair, the stubborn eyes, the laugh, the cough that had started small and quiet and seemed like nothing. She thought about Rosalind Kobe, 4 years old. A man she barely knew had just said that name in her kitchen, and the weight it carried had filled the room completely, and she understood it, the specific weight of a name that has been kept inside for too long, the way it compresses under pressure until the moment of its release, when it expands to fill the available space. She thought about Ed. She thought about what he had told her on the 14th. The tin box, the doctor's visits, the timeline he had been carrying since October without sharing it. She had processed this in the way she processed most of the large things that happened to her. Not all at once, not theatrically, but steadily in the hours and days that followed, working it through the same part of herself that worked through problems of construction and cold, and the forces that move through materials in ways you cannot always see. She understood that Ed was running toward something with the time he had left. She understood that the thing he was running toward was her work. Seeing it recognized, seeing it used, seeing it stand against the argument that it didn't work. She understood that this was a gift he was giving her, and that the gift had a cost she did not want to think about too directly. She sat with her trembling hand on the table, and the wind moving along the outer wall, and the children sleeping and her husband breathing in his chair, and the warmth of 68 degrees all around her. She thought Owen did not die for nothing. She could not have said exactly what she meant by this. Not yet. Not in words that would hold the whole of it. But she felt it as a fact, the way she felt the temperature of a wall under her palm, directly without mediation, without the need for further argument. The longest night of the year was almost over. Outside, the cold held. Inside, Ruth Larson sat at the kitchen table in the warmth she had built, and she waited for the morning. Harlan Creek Valley, Montana, January 1932 through spring 1933 and beyond. June. Whitmore ate soup on the morning of the fourth day. She sat up in the bed, Ruth's bed in Ruth's back room, and took the bowl that Ruth offered her, and ate it slowly with the careful attention of someone whose body has recently reminded her not to take the act of eating for granted. She did not speak much. She did not need to. The color had come back to her face in the night, and with it the particular quality of presence that had been absent for 3 days. The sense of a person being fully inside their own body again, occupying it, completely aware of it, as something worth inhabiting. Carlton sat beside the bed. He had not left the room except when necessary. He had not eaten enough and had not slept in any meaningful way, and looked in the January morning light like a man who has been taken apart and incompletely reassembled, the large, confident shape of him still present, but something inside it rearranged. He watched June eat the soup with an expression that had no name in ordinary language. It was beyond relief. It was beyond gratitude. It was the face of someone who has stood at the edge of a specific and irreversible loss and been allowed by something they do not understand and cannot claim credit for to step back from it. June set the empty bowl on the quilt. She looked at her husband. She lifted her hand. He took it. He pressed it against his face. He did not make a sound. He simply held her hand against his cheek and closed his eyes. Ruth collected the bowl from the bed and walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the counter with her back to the room for a moment, her hands on the edge of the wooden surface, her eyes on the window, and the January morning beyond it. Pale cold, the valley visible in the clear light. Smoke rising from the distant houses, the mountains white, and absolute against a sky the color of old iron. She thought it held, not triumphantly, not with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been proven right after a long argument, just factually clearly the way a builder notes that a structure has passed its first real test. The wall held. The air inside the air held. The warmth held. June Whitmore was alive and eating soup on the fourth morning, and the temperature on the kitchen wall still read 66 degrees, and the fire in the stove was small and measured and not desperate. It held. Carlton found her in the kitchen before the children were awake. He came in quietly, which was not a quality normally associated with Carlton Whitmore. He stood near the doorway with his hat in his hands and his eyes directed at the middle distance between himself and the floor. And he had the look of a man who has been composing something for several hours and is still not certain it is ready. Ruth poured coffee and set a cup on the table without looking at him. He sat down. He held the cup without drinking from it. He tried to begin twice. The first time produced nothing. The second time produced half a word and then stopped. Ruth waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent 30 years learning to wait for the right moment in the construction of a thing, and she understood that forcing a moment before it was ready produced poor work. The third attempt succeeded. "I almost lost my wife," Carlton said. because I was too proud to be wrong in front of people." He stopped. He started again. "I put the name on it. The Old Woman's Folly. That was mine. I said it first, and I said it loud, and I said it in the right place for it to go everywhere." He looked at the coffee cup. "And you went out into 35 below zero, in the middle of the night, to bring her home." Silence. "There is no way to thank a person for that," he said. "I don't think there is a language for it, so I won't try." He looked up. His eyes were direct, which cost him something. "There is only one thing I can do. I can ask you to teach me. Will you teach me, Mrs. Larson?" Ruth looked at him across the kitchen table. She looked at the hat in his hands, and the effort in his face, and the particular quality of a man who has arrived at honesty by the longest possible route and is nonetheless genuinely there. "Get your sled," she said. "Call your boys. The cold is not finished with us." He blinked. "Now, the Miller baby has been sick since November. The Hendersons have an old woman who hasn't been warm in 3 weeks. The Purcell family has 4 children under 10. She stood up. "The cold is not finished with us, Mr. Whitmore, and I am not finished with it." He stood up. He put his hat on. "I'll get the boys," he said. They worked for 2 days at the Whitmore property. First, a windbreak wall along the north and west, faces 2 feet of air-gap tar paper on the outer surface vented at the bottom and top, with the same baffle system Ruth had used on her own structure. It was not as complete as what Ruth had built around her own cabin. It was the quick version, the emergency version, the version you build when you understand the principle and need results before the next storm. Carlton's 2 sons were large young men who worked without complaint and learned fast. Ruth showed them once and then watched while they replicated it, correcting their angle on the baffle vent and the depth of the gravel drainage bed, not speaking more than necessary. Letting the work teach what the work could teach. By the end of the 2nd day, the Whitmore cabin held 54 degrees, with the stove running at half capacity. Carlton stood in his own kitchen that evening and felt the temperature with his body, not by looking at the thermometer, but by standing still and letting his nervous system report what it was receiving. 54 degrees was not 68. It was not the extraordinary differential Ruth had achieved with her full double-wall construction, but it was 14 degrees warmer than the 40 degrees the cabin had been holding before, and it had been achieved with materials that cost $28 and 2 days of labor. And the woodpile that had been disappearing at an unsustainable rate was now lasting at a pace that he could calculate with relief rather than dread. He went to the saloon on Saturday. He was not a subtle man, and he did not try to be subtle about this. He went to the saloon and he stood at the bar, and he hit the surface with the flat of his hand hard enough to make the glasses rattle. And the room went quiet, and Carlton Whitmore said what Carlton Whitmore said when he had decided something mattered. "Listen to me, all of you." They listened. In difficult times, people listen to loud voices. This had worked against Ruth Larson for 6 months. It would work for her now. "I was a damn fool," he said. "I was the loudest damn fool in this valley, which made me the most dangerous kind. I put a name on something I didn't understand, and I said it where it would travel, and I cost a woman 6 months of her neighbor's respect." He looked at the bar top. "And then the winter came and my wife nearly died in a cabin. I was too proud to improve, and that woman went out at 2 in the morning in 35 below zero and brought June home." The room was completely still. "There is a Norwegian woman up the road," he said, "who knows something the rest of us do not know. Something our grandfathers should have known and didn't. Something that can keep your family alive in a winter like this one, without burning through everything you have laid in and still watching your children shiver. He picked up his glass. You go to her with your hat in your hand and you ask her to teach you. And you do not waste the asking with excuses or explanations. You just ask. He drank. He set the glass down. That is all I have to say. 3 families came to the Larson property the following week. By the end of January, 6 more. By mid-February, Ruth had personally supervised the construction of some version of the Larson Wall, which was what people had begun calling it quietly. The name slipping into use the way accurate names do, because they fit on 11 properties in Harlan Creek Valley. None of them were as complete as her original. Most were variations of the windbreak approach she had used at the Whitmore property, a single additional wall along the most exposed faces, a controlled air gap, proper venting. Each one cost between $20 and $40 in materials. Each one produced results that could be measured in the temperature of a room and the depth of a wood pile, and the faces of women who had stopped having to wear their coats inside their own kitchens. Winifred Holt watched all of this from her particular position, close enough to observe far enough back not to become part of the story. She had gone back to teaching when the school reopened in January, but she spent her evenings at the kitchen table with her notebook, writing and rewriting the document that had been accumulating in her mind since December. It was not a newspaper article. She had understood that early, that the newspaper form, with its requirement for compression and its appetite for the dramatic moment, rather than the sustained truth, was the wrong container for what she was trying to preserve. What she was writing was something more like what Ed had once described to her in a conversation about the engineering texts he liked to read, a case study. A document of observation and measurement and principle written so that someone who had never seen the Larson cabin could understand not just what Ruth had built, but why it worked and how to build it themselves. She showed Ruth a draft in the second week of February. Ruth read it at the kitchen table. She read it the way she read engineering drawings, twice through, without comment, then back through specific sections with close attention, her finger moving along certain lines of text. She set it down. The ventilation calculations, she said. Winifred had her notebook open. Yes, the formula you have here assumes the outer structure is fully sealed at the base. It isn't. There is a 4-inch gap across the full perimeter, unobstructed. The calculation changes. Winifred wrote this down. Otherwise, Ruth said. She paused. She looked at the document again. Otherwise, it is accurate. She pushed it back across the table. One condition, she said. Winifred looked up. Write about the wall, Ruth said. Not about me. The wall is what matters. When I am gone, the wall needs to be understood by people who never met me. She looked at Winifred steadily. Can you do that? Winifred looked at the document. She thought about how to answer this honestly. I can try, she said. The wall is built by a person. The person matters to understanding the wall. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Write it so the wall can stand without me, she said. That is the condition. Winifred nodded. She spent 3 more weeks on it after that conversation, revising with the focus of someone who has been given a specific and demanding standard to meet. When she was finished, the document was 31 pages. It contained temperature records, construction specifications, materials lists, ventilation calculations corrected per Ruth's instruction, and a methodological section that drew on Niels Drummond's journal, with Vera Drummond's written permission to establish the theoretical foundation that the practical construction expressed. It was the work of a good teacher who had learned something real and understood that her job was to transmit it intact. Ruth read the final version and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, yes, that is correct. This was, Winifred understood, the only endorsement she was going to receive, and it was enough. On the last Sunday of January, Constance Colby stood up in the Harlan Creek Valley Church. She had been planning it for 2 weeks. She had discussed it with no one, not even Harlan, who learned what his wife intended to do only when she rose from the pew beside him and turned to face the congregation with the composed, unhurried certainty of a woman who has decided something and is not open to further discussion of it. The pastor, a young man from Wisconsin in his second year in Harlan Creek, had opened the floor for testimony as he did most Sundays. He stepped back with some surprise when Constance stood. She was not a frequent speaker in that context. She looked at the congregation. She said, "I want to ask the women of this church a question." She asked how many of them had whispered this past year about the Larson property and the structure rising there. She asked how many had spoken the name that Carlton Whitmore had given it. She did not say the name with the particular tone that means we are sensible people, and that person is not. She asked how many had expressed in the quilting circle or at the general store or across a kitchen table some form of pity for the family and some form of satisfaction at being safely distant from their peculiarity. The church was quiet in a way that meant the questions were landing. "My husband," she said, "went to the Larson cabin on the night of December the 21st, the longest night of the year. He drove there in 38 below zero because he needed to know if he had been wrong. He came home at 1 o'clock in the morning and he came to bed and he put his arms around me." Her voice did not break, but it changed, altered slightly the way the surface of still water changes when something passes through it from below. "And for the first time in 23 years, he said our daughter's name." She paused. "Rosalind," she said. He said her name, and in the dark, after 23 years. The front pew held its breath. "I had prayed for that," Constance said. "For 23 years, I had prayed to hear that name from him, and I had nearly given up on the prayer being answered. And it was answered in a cabin that this congregation spent 6 months treating as a joke." She looked at the pew where June and Carlton Whitmore sat. She looked at the pew where George Finch sat. She looked finally at the pew near the back where Ruth and Ed Larson sat with Nora between them. "I have been wrong about Ruth Larson. I am asking her in this room to forgive me." The church turned. 40-some faces rotating slowly toward the back of the room, not with the cruelty of a crowd enjoying a spectacle, but with the tentative attention of people who are not sure what they are about to witness and are preparing themselves for something. Vera Drummond rose from the pew on the left aisle before anyone else spoke. She rose slowly with her oak cane in the manner of someone who is old enough to know that rising slowly is not a weakness, but a form of respect for what the body has carried. She turned to face the room. She reached into her coat and brought out the leather journal. She opened it to a page near the middle, a page Ruth had marked with a strip of flour sack paper months ago. She began to read in Danish. The words meant nothing to most of the people in that room, but the sound of them was precise and formal, and carried in it the quality of something that had been written carefully by someone who was certain of what they were saying. When she finished the passage, she lowered the journal and looked at the congregation. "My first husband wrote that in 1889, she said. "He was a shipwright. He worked in Greenland. He understood something about air and cold and the way a wall can be built to hold warmth that the rest of the world did not know yet. He died in 1891 before he could build it." She looked at the worn cover of the journal. "I carried this for 40 years. I did not know who to give it to." She looked at Ruth. "Now I know. And she has built what he could not." She sat down. Ruth did not intend to stand. She had not planned to speak. She was in the general practice of her life. A person who communicated through work rather than words, who considered the thing built to be a more honest statement than anything that could be said about it. She had sat in her pew through Constance Colby's testimony and Vera Drummond's Danish passage and the turning of the congregation, and felt something moving through the room that she recognized distantly as the slow rotation of a community toward a new orientation. It did not require her to speak. The work had spoken. The 54 degrees in the Whitmore kitchen had spoken. The 11 families who had spent the past 2 weeks building variations of the Larson Wall had spoken more eloquently than she could, and yet she stood. She stood the way you stand when something requires it, not because you have decided to, but because the body which knows things, the deliberate mind is sometimes slow to understand, has already begun the action, and the deliberate mind must now find the words to fill it. "My husband is dying," she said. The church went still in a way that was different from the previous stillnesses, more complete, more interior. "He is known since October. He was diagnosed with a heart condition in October, and he did not tell me." She said this without accusation, as a fact. "He did not tell me because he knew that if I understood how little time we had, I might stop building. He did not want me to stop building." She looked at her hands. "He began saving money for the materials 8 months before he told me. He started the night Nora first coughed, before I had drawn a single line on a flour sack. He understood what needed to be done before I had found the words for it." The pew where Ed sat was behind her. She did not turn to look at him. She did not need to. She could feel him in the room the way you feel the particular warmth of a specific lamp, distinct, located, irreplaceable. "I built that wall," she said, "because I lost a grandson in 1908. His name was Owen. He was 5 years old, and he died of cold in a cabin I thought was sufficient. I have carried that for 23 years. She stopped. She looked at the winter light coming through the church windows. Pale, flat, the light of a season that does not apologize for itself. "I built that wall so that Nora would not be Owen, so that no child in this valley would be Owen. Not because I am clever, because I could not be one more person who built a coffin and called it a home." She paused. "Owen did not die for nothing. I understand that now. He lives in every child who is warm tonight." She sat down. Nora beside her slipped her small hand into Ruth's. Ruth held it. The left hand, the trembling one. It was not trembling now. She held her granddaughter's hand in the Harlan Creek Valley Church with the winter outside, and the warmth of 60-some bodies in a room together. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, something that was not exactly peace, but was its near neighbor. The quiet that comes when the largest question you have been carrying receives not an answer, but a recognition. The man from Billings arrived in the second week of March. He was well dressed for a valley that had been living through the Depression in practical fabrics, and he carried a leather briefcase with brass fittings. And he drove a sedan that the children of Harlan Creek came out to look at from a distance, because it was newer than anything else on the valley road. He had read Winifred's document. A version of it had reached the state agricultural office in Helena through Theodore Vance's channels, and from there had moved in the way that useful information moves in difficult times quickly and without ceremony to wherever it was needed. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table and opened his briefcase and laid out a contract. He represented a construction company based in Billings, with interests across Montana and Wyoming. The document in front of Ruth was thorough and professionally executed. It transferred the design rights to what the document called the Larson Thermal Separation Method to his company, which would hold the patent and license the technique to builders across the region. The number at the bottom of the final page was $18,000. Ruth looked at the contract. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way she looked at a wall. She was assessing steadily without hurry. allowing her understanding of it to complete before she responded to it. "No," she said. The man looked up from his briefcase. He had anticipated negotiation. He had prepared for negotiation. This was a single, quiet, unprefaced word, and it did not sound like the opening of a negotiation. "Mrs. Larson, I understand this may seem. My father taught me his trade for free," she said. He learned it from his father, who learned it from his. Niels Drummond worked out the mathematics in 1887. In a journal that his widow kept for 40 years because she did not know who else to give it to. He never charged anyone. The ocean teaches its lessons for free to anyone willing to go out on it. She looked at the man across the table. "I will not sell what was never mine to sell." A pause. "The design belongs to anyone who needs it," she said. That is where it was always going. The man from Billings sat for a moment with his briefcase open and his contract on the table, and the expression of someone who has prepared extensively for a conversation that is not taking place. He picked up the contract. He put it back in the briefcase. He latched the brass fittings. He stood. At the door, he paused with the hesitation of a man who is professionally obligated to make one more attempt. Ruth looked at him. He read something in her face that resolved the hesitation, and he went out without speaking again. She heard his sedan start. She heard it back down the lane and turn onto the valley road and diminish south toward Billings. She stood at the kitchen window and watched it go. Ed came in from the porch. He stood beside her and looked at the retreating car, and then looked at his wife's profile against the window light. 18,000, he said, not reproachfully, as an observation. "Yes," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Then he went back to his chair. 2 weeks later, Augustus Whitfield arrived from Helena. He was Ed's older brother, a lawyer 62 years old, who had the Whitfield family jaw and the Whitfield family directness and none of Ed's quietness. He came with a letter from the Harlan Creek Valley Bank, which he set on the kitchen table without preamble. The bank manager, a man named Corbin, who had spent his career in the practical business of understanding what the valley needed to survive, had read Winifred's document. He had driven to the Larson property on a Tuesday afternoon while Ruth was supervising construction at the Henderson place, and had walked the full perimeter of the double-walled structure alone, measuring the air gap with his own tape measure, pressing his palm against the inner wall, reading the thermometer on the kitchen wall through the window. He had driven home and sat in his office and written a letter to the loan committee. The letter that Augustus now placed in front of Ruth informed her that the remaining balance on the Larson property mortgage had been restructured by the bank's discretionary fund, with a new payment schedule calibrated to what the valley's current conditions could realistically support. It was not forgiveness of the debt. It was something more durable than forgiveness. It was recognition. The acknowledgement in the practical language of a bank that what Ruth Larson had built had value, that extended beyond the property line and into the community's capacity to survive the winters ahead. Ruth read the letter twice. She set it on the table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprising herself, the short, involuntary sound of a person who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the moment it is lifted, the body's first response is not relief, but a kind of incredulous amusement at how long the carrying went on. She put her hand over her mouth. The laugh subsided. She picked up the letter and went to find Ed. Theodore Vance returned on the 19th of January with a calibrated meteorological thermometer in a leather case and a clipboard, and the careful, exact bearing of a man who trusts measurement above all other forms of knowing. He measured for 2 hours. He walked the full perimeter of the outer structure, noting the gap dimensions, the ventilation openings, the gravel drainage bed. the relationship between the outer and inner wall heights. He measured the interior temperature at 6 points in the cabin. He measured the exterior temperature at 3. He noted the wind direction and speed. He recorded everything on his clipboard in a handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. Then he sat at the kitchen table and read Ed's document. He had been told about the document by Augustus Whitfield, who had been told about it by Winifred Holt. He read it with the attention of someone encountering a professional peer, rather than a neighbor's contribution, going back to certain pages following calculations to their conclusions, checking the ventilation formula against the field measurements he had just taken. He set it down. "Mr. Larson," he said. Ed looked up from his chair. "This is a complete technical record," Vance said. "This is more rigorous than any document currently in the State Agricultural Archive on cold climate residential construction." Ed was quiet for a moment. "My wife built it," he said. "I only wrote it down." Vance looked at Ed. He looked at Ruth, who was standing at the stove with her back to the room in the way she stood when she was listening to something that mattered to her but didn't want to be observed listening. He looked back at the document. "May I take this to Helena?" he said. "Take Winifred Holt's version," Ruth said, without turning. "It is more complete. Mine was written for the building. Hers was written for the reading." Vance nodded. He made a note. He looked at the temperature readings on his clipboard. Again, the exterior and interior figures arranged in 2 columns. The differential between them expressed in numbers that required no interpretation. 103 degrees of separation. He had been measuring cold climate structures for 11 years. He had never seen this. The document left for Helena in the 3rd week of January. It reached the State Agricultural Office before February. It was reviewed by the State Engineer's Office in March. By April, the state of Montana had issued a formal technical bulletin, Cold Climate Residential Thermal Performance, the Larson Method, and begun distribution through the county extension offices. By summer, it had crossed into Wyoming and the Dakotas. By 1935, Theodore Vance could report in a letter to Winifred Holt that some version of what Ruth Larson had built in Harlan Creek Valley in the summer and fall of 1931 had been constructed or adapted in more than 5,000 homes across the northern states. Ruth and Harlan Colby began working together in the spring of 1932. This was not announced. It did not need to be announced. Harlan simply appeared at the Larson property one April morning with his tools and his 30 years of building knowledge and his particular understanding of Montana timber and foundation conditions. And Ruth was already at work, and they worked together without a great deal of discussion, because people who understand construction communicate through the work rather than around it. Harlan brought structural precision that Ruth's shipwright background had not emphasized. Ruth brought the thermal principle that Harlan's builder's training had not previously included. The combination produced something better than either of them had been building separately. They never set a price. They worked for what the families could provide: food mostly, and labor, and sometimes nothing at all when the family had nothing. Harlan did not take more than he needed from this work. When Ruth asked him why standing in the frame of a half-finished windbreak wall on the Purcell property in June, with the sound of 3 children playing in the yard, he looked at the wall for a moment. "This is how I bring Rosalind home," he said. Ruth did not respond. She picked up her hammer. They went back to work. The summer came. The valley changed, not dramatically, not all at once in the way that real changes in communities almost never happen. But it changed. Families who had spent their winters in the grinding arithmetic of wood and cold and warmth, barely maintained, found themselves with a different relationship to the season. The wall between inside and outside was no longer a permeable border across which the winter conducted its slow, inevitable victory. It was a real boundary, a held line. Women stood in their kitchens without coats. Children slept without 3 quilts piled over them and woke up without the particular resigned stiffness of small bodies that have spent the night bracing against the cold. Old people stopped coughing. Carlton Whitmore began to speak of the Larson Wall, the way converts speak of conversion, with the slightly excessive enthusiasm of someone compensating for prior skepticism. He became its most vocal advocate in Harlan Creek, and the neighboring valleys appearing at community meetings in other towns, with the directness that had always been his defining quality now redirected toward a purpose that served rather than dismissed. He was an effective advocate. He spoke to men who were already spending more than they had on wood, who were watching their families suffer through winters that were costing them in ways the economics of the Depression made unsustainable. He spoke to men who understood Carlton Whitmore, men who, unlike Ruth, spoke the language Carlton spoke. He never took any credit for the design. This was perhaps the most changed thing about Carlton Whitmore after the winter of 1931. He had learned something about the cost of misplaced credit, and he had learned it in the only way that knowledge like that sticks through the body, through fear, through 3 days in a corner chair, watching his wife breathe. Ed Larson died in the spring of 1933. He died on a Tuesday morning in April, which was in Harlan Creek, the month when the first suggestion of warmth returns to the air. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth. The angle of the light changing the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes. The creek beginning to run louder. He had made it through the second winter in the double-walled cabin. He had made it through the confirmation of everything Ruth had built, and the letter from the bank and the technical bulletin from Helena, and the 5,000 homes, and the spring of 1932, and the summer and the second fall and the second winter. He had held on long enough to see the wall stand. Ruth was with him. She had been with him through the night, sitting beside the bed, in the chair she had placed there. 2 months earlier, when the doctor's timeline had become unmistakable, reading by lamplight when he slept, setting the book down when he woke. She had been with him the way she was with most things, completely without performance, without the need to be observed in her completeness. He woke before dawn and looked at the ceiling and then turned his head and looked at her. "Is Nora warm?" he said. Ruth looked at her husband, his face in the early light. The yellow hair long gone to white, the quiet eyes, the particular quality of attention that had been looking at her from across rooms for 41 years. "Nora is warm, Ed," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a man who has received the answer he was hoping for and finds it sufficient. He closed his eyes. He went home. Ruth sat beside the bed for a long time after. She did not cry immediately. She sat with her hand over his, the left hand the trembling one, and she held what had just happened inside herself the way you hold a candle flame in cupped hands, against the wind carefully, with the full attention of the body. Not because you can keep it burning forever, but because you can keep it burning a little longer. She looked at his face. She thought about 41 years. She thought about the tin box with its $90 started the night Nora first coughed before Ruth had drawn the first rectangle on the first flour sack. She thought about all the things a person can say without speaking. After a while, she got up. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the one where she kept the ledger and Vera Drummond's journal, and the documents in their various forms. She opened it. She took out the document in Ed's handwriting. She had not read it since the night she first found it. She took it to the kitchen table. She sat down. She read it. It was everything. Every measurement she had taken through every stage of the construction. The foundation trench specifications and the gravel bed depth, and the post placements, and the gap dimensions and the ventilation baffle angles, and the thermal performance data from every week of that first winter temperature. Differentials, wood consumption, wind direction, precipitation. The calculations from Niels Drummond's journal translated and verified and integrated with her own field data. The corrected ventilation formula as she had specified to Winifred. A materials list with costs and sources. A construction sequence, a troubleshooting section. 38 pages in Ed's careful, slanted handwriting on the inside front cover. In the same hand, a single line, "Ruth built this. I only wrote it down." She set her hand flat on the page, the left hand. It was trembling. She sat at the table for a long time. She thought about Owen. She thought about Rosalind. She thought about Niels Drummond dying in 1891 with his calculations unfinished. She thought about Vera carrying the journal for 40 years. She thought about all the windows through which the cold had come, all the walls that it held, and the walls that hadn't, all the children who had coughed in the night, and the children who had slept through the cold in peace. She thought about Ed in the evenings she had believed he was sleeping, writing it all down in his careful hand. Night after night, in the time she thought he had left behind, filling the pages with her work so that it could outlast both of them. Not because he needed to, because he knew she needed him to. She opened the front cover to the inside page. She took her pen. She wrote in Norwegian because some things belong in the language where they first mattered. For Owen and for Ed. Forever. She closed the document. She put it back in the cedar chest. Ruth Larson lived for 38 more years. She lived to 1971. She was 103 years old. She worked alongside Harlan Coby until he died in 1951. She worked alone after that, slower the stroke's effects more apparent in her left side. But her mind as precise as it had always been, her eye for a wall and a gap, and the relationship between a building and the cold it faced unchanged by age. She received visitors from distances she had not anticipated. Engineers from state universities, extension, agents from 4 states. A man from the Department of Agriculture in Washington who came in 1948 and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours with a transcript of Winifred Holt's document and a set of questions so detailed that she had to get her own notes to answer them. She answered every question. She never charged anyone for the answering. The cabin stood. It stood through Ruth's old age when she sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the light move across the Montana mountains the way she had watched it for more than 60 years in this valley. It stood through the seasons and the changes that accumulate across decades. The valley changing, the meaning changing the families, changing the children of the families she had helped growing up and moving away and sometimes coming back. The double wall weathered. The outer planking was replaced twice. The foundation trench was re-graveled. The inner cabin, the original one, the one that had been warm when everything else was cold, remained as Ruth had known it, solid, held. Nora Larson was 46 years old when her grandmother died. She drove up from Missoula, where she lived with her own family, her own children who had grown up hearing the story, who had grown up knowing the wall, the way children know the landmarks of their earliest landscape. She came into the cabin that had been in her life since she was 6 years old, and she went to the bedroom, and she sat with the quiet of the house around her, and the Montana spring outside the window, and the particular stillness of a place that has just lost its longest occupant. After a while, she went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She opened it. Inside, on top of everything else, was the document in Ed Larson's handwriting. 38 pages, the cover worn from handling over 38 years, the spine reinforced with the same leather cord that had held Niels Drummond's journal together. Nora picked it up. She opened the front cover. She read the 4 words Ruth had written on the inside page. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the document in her hands and wept, not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, but with the particular emotion that does not have a simple name. The emotion of understanding something all the way through, of having the last piece of a thing click into place and seeing for the first time the full shape of what it was. She sat there for a long time. Outside, through the window, a spring wind moved through the pines on the ridge above Harlan Creek Valley. It came down from the mountains the way it always came, looking for gaps, looking for cracks, the way it had always looked, the way it would always look, patient, absolute, indifferent to everything except the weakness it could find. It moved along the outer wall of the cabin. It found no weakness. It moved on. The cabin stood in the April morning, warm and quiet, and still the cedar chest open at the foot of the bed. The document in Nora's hands, the 2 names written in Norwegian on the inside cover, of a 38-page record of what one woman had known, and one man had written down, so that it would not disappear when they did. For Owen, and for Ed, forever. The spring wind moved through the pines and found nothing to take and went on.